March 1974, 2:18 a.m. Local time. The position report went out on schedule, transmitted from the aircraft as it crossed the Arctic routing corridor. The message listed a latitude that did not match the navigator's handwritten log for the same minute. The difference was small. It was still enough to matter. Within the first quarter hour, the discrepancy existed in two places at once: on the navigator's page and in the communications header that would be filed when the aircraft landed. The approved route included a buffer zone near Soviet-controlled airspace. A mismatch on paper could place the aircraft inside that buffer, even if the actual track corrected minutes later. For the people who signed the routing, that was not a dramatic problem. It was an administrative one, with clearance implications. This flight was Air Force One, operating on an Arctic route in 1974. The record at stake was the navigation and communications chain that proved where the aircraft had been, minute by minute. The aircraft had departed hours earlier under a standard winter routing. Arctic flights were routine for long-haul government travel at the time, chosen to shorten distance and avoid congestion in lower latitudes. The corridor required scheduled position reports, specific time windows, and consistent documentation across logs. The navigator's job was to reconcile drift, wind, and track. The communications specialist's job was to send the position as formatted text, using approved headers that fed into multiple systems at once. At 2:18 a.m., the navigator recorded the fix, noting wind correction and ground speed. The communications message, sent within the same minute, carried a slightly different coordinate. The difference amounted to a narrow band of latitude. On a normal day, such a correction would be crossed out, initialed, and explained. This one was not. No alarms sounded in the air. No intercept occurred. The engines ran at cruise power. The routine continued. Several hours later, as the aircraft approached its destination, the navigator made a routine adjustment on the drift sheet, entering a correction later than usual in the sequence. The entry was time-stamped. The communications log showed the next scheduled report went out 2 minutes outside the expected window. Both were documented. Neither, by itself, was unusual. The issue became visible only after landing, when the flight packet was assembled for return to Andrews. The packet included the nav log, the communications copies, and the flight plan amendments. One amendment page showed an overwritten reporting point time rather than a clean correction. The required initial was missing. By mid-morning, the packet moved through its normal path. It passed a desk where flight plans were stamped and sorted. It was placed into a folder labeled with the route and date. It entered a locked cabinet that held similar folders, arranged by week. The clerk who handled that cabinet worked a regular schedule. She arrived just before 8 a.m., reviewed incoming packets, and checked them against distribution lists. Her routine involved scanning for format issues first: missing initials, unclear corrections, pages out of order. She was not looking for violations. She was looking for filing problems. On this packet, she paused. The overwritten time stood out. The missing initials stood out more. She compared the navlog to the communications copy and saw the coordinate difference. It was the same minute. It was not resolved on the page. She marked it as a format discrepancy and routed it to the operations duty officer. That action was logged at 10:42 a.m. The duty officer compared the documents side by side. The difference remained. The approved route documentation showed the buffer clearly. The navlog implied a brief excursion toward it. The communications header implied something slightly different again. None of the pages stated an explanation that closed the gap. By the end of the day, a short note was added to the file. Coordinate mismatch verify. The note did not accuse anyone of error. It did not suggest intent. It triggered a request for additional copies. 2 days later, a separate system reflected the same moment. A coordination log showed a brief entry noting track correlation during the Arctic segment, followed by a time-stamped phone call. The call was routine. The entry was routine. Together, they confirmed that the position mattered enough to be checked. The review that followed would last 14 months. At the time, none of the people involved described the flight as almost landing anywhere it should not have. The aircraft never descended toward foreign territory. What it nearly did was leave an incomplete paper trail at a sensitive boundary. In 1974, that was enough to matter. In 1974, Arctic routing followed a predictable rhythm. Long-haul government flights used published corridors that balanced distance, fuel planning, and reporting requirements. Each segment came with fixed expectations: when a position would be taken, how it would be recorded, and how it would be transmitted. Deviations were allowed. Documentation was not optional. On board the aircraft, the navigator's routine was set by the clock. Position fixes were taken at regular intervals, entered by hand, and checked against drift calculations. Wind corrections were noted, not explained. If a correction came late, it was still logged with the time it was made. The page mattered more than the prose. Communications followed a parallel routine. Scheduled position reports went out using approved message formats. Each transmission included a header that routed the message through relay stations and into permanent logs. The communications specialist tracked these reports against a checklist, marking the time sent and the acknowledgement received. A delay of a minute or two was not unusual in Arctic conditions. It was still written down. On the ground, the routines were slower and more repetitive. At Andrews, flight packets arrived in batches, usually the morning after a mission. Each packet moved through the same sequence: receipt, comparison against the distribution list, format check, then filing. The cabinet used for presidential airlift records was organized by date and route. Nothing entered it without a quick review. Marion Keller had been doing this work long enough to rely on pattern rather than memory. She worked weekdays, arriving just before 8 a.m. and leaving at 4:30 p.m. Her first task each day was to clear the previous day's packets. She checked initials, looked for overwritten entries, and verified that amendments were properly chained. If something broke the pattern, she flagged it. Most days, nothing did. Arctic flights came back with thick logs and clean corrections. Weather notes were attached. Drift sheets were complete. When there was an issue, it was usually obvious: a missing page, a time written in the wrong column, a duplicate copy where an original should be. The packet from the March flight fit the routine until it didn't. The overwritten reporting point time was small, but it violated the standard correction method. The missing initial mattered more. Amendments required a clear signature trail so that anyone reading the packet later could see who approved what and when. Marion did not escalate issues herself. Her routine ended with routing discrepancies to the operations duty officer. That handoff was logged, stamped, and timed. On this packet, it happened mid-morning, after the initial sort. The operations duty officer's routine was different. The job involved briefings, phone calls, and constant interruption. Document checks were done between other tasks. When a discrepancy came in, it was compared against reference materials kept nearby, approved routes, buffer descriptions, and prior packets from similar flights. The Arctic corridor used that week had been flown before. Its buffer near Soviet-controlled airspace was clearly defined in the approval. The duty officer's comparison showed that the nav log, the communications header, and the flight plan amendment did not align cleanly on that point. None of the documents explained the difference. The normal response at this stage was verification, not accusation. Copies were requested. The original packet stayed in the cabinet. Additional documents were pulled from parallel systems and attached with paper clips. Each request generated a short memo, dated and initialed. By the end of the week, the routine had expanded. What began as a filing issue now required cross-checking with external logs. That step was still standard procedure. It happened quietly, during regular hours, without any change to the aircraft's operations schedule. For everyone involved, the work continued as usual. Flights departed. Logs were written. Packets were filed. The discrepancy sat in a folder, waiting for the next document that would either close it or make it heavier. The first anomaly was not the coordinate itself. It was how the paperwork handled it. On the flight plan amendment page, the reporting point time had been overwritten instead of corrected using the standard strike and initial method. The correction sat alone, without an explanation line. The required initial was missing. For a long-haul Arctic flight, that was unusual enough to be logged. The discrepancy was dated March 1974, but the review did not begin immediately. It followed the normal pace of document verification. Requests for additional copies went out during the next business cycle. Each request was time-stamped and routed through the same clerical channels as any other follow-up. When the additional documents arrived, They did not resolve the issue. The navigator's log showed a position fix at 2:18 a.m., written cleanly, with wind correction noted. The communications message copy showed a position for the same minute, formatted correctly but offset in latitude. The difference was narrow, but it crossed the internal buffer description used in the routing approval. Weather notes were checked next. The flight had encountered predictable Arctic conditions. A routine deviation note existed, logged with a time window and altitude reference. It explained why a correction was made, but not why the coordinate appeared differently across documents. By the following week, the duty officer annotated the file with a neutral phrase, "does not reconcile." That annotation triggered a standard escalation step. The packet was flagged for cross-system comparison. This step brought in a second set of records. Coordination logs from air defense tracking were requested, along with relay timestamps from the communications chain. These were not extraordinary measures. Any discrepancy near a controlled boundary required confirmation that the aircraft's documented track matched external observation. The coordination log arrived first. It showed a routine entry during the Arctic segment, time-stamped within minutes of the disputed position. The entry noted a track correlation check and a brief follow-up call. The call duration was short. The entry was closed the same day. The presence of that note did not indicate a violation. It indicated attention. Someone, somewhere, had compared the track against expectations and written it down. At this stage, the anomaly was defined narrowly. It was a documentation issue tied to a specific minute of flight time. No one described it as an airspace incursion. The language stayed procedural. Mismatch, discrepancy, verification pending. For the clerk who first flagged the packet, the anomaly changed her routine slightly. She added a reminder slip to the folder and placed it at the front of the cabinet section for that week. Each morning, when she opened the cabinet, the slip was visible. Each afternoon, it was returned to the same position. The anomaly did not grow quickly. It waited on paper, accumulating references. By the end of the month, 3 documents pointed to the same moment: the nav log, the communications header, and the coordination note. None contradicted the others outright. They simply did not align. That lack of alignment was enough to move the review forward. The early evidence arrived in pieces over several weeks, and it came from routine systems that rarely disagreed with each other. The first set was the communications relay record. It showed the position report transmitted at 2:18 a.m., routed through the standard Arctic relay chain. The timestamp matched the flight log. The coordinate did not. The message header used a template common to that period, one that required manual entry of grid references. The format was correct. The content was questionable. Next came the drift sheets. These were photocopied and attached to the packet with a cover memo dated the 3rd of April 1974. The sheets showed a late correction entered after the disputed position fix. The correction itself was standard practice. The timing placed it just outside the usual interval, which explained the change, but not the mismatch across documents. By mid-April, the operations duty officer had assembled a comparison set: nav log, communications copy, drift sheets, weather deviation note, and the original routing approval. Each page was marked with a small adhesive tab. The tabs lined up almost everywhere. They did not line up at 2:18 a.m. A short internal memo summarized the finding in plain terms: coordinate difference across sources, cause undetermined. The memo did not recommend action. It recommended continuation. This triggered the next procedural step. An internal inspection team requested exhibits. Their request memo listed specific items: original nav logs, certified communications copies, relay timestamps, and any ancillary records that could anchor time and position independently. One such anchor arrived unexpectedly. A fuel receipt from an intermediate planning stop included a time of service stamp that aligned with the aircraft's projected track and speed. It did not mention coordinates. It did not need to. When plotted against the disputed minute, it supported one set of timing assumptions over the other. This receipt had been routine paperwork, filed separately with financial records. Its appearance in the review reframed earlier evidence. The coordinate mismatch now sat between 2 anchors that agreed on time but implied different tracks. For the clerk, the routine changed again. She was asked to pull prior Arctic flight packets from the same quarter. These were laid out on a long table, one after another, during a scheduled review session that lasted most of a morning. The session began at 9 a.m. and ended before lunch. The goal was simple: look for similar patterns. 2 packets showed late drift corrections. One showed a communications header using the same grid reference template. Neither had missing initials. Neither showed a coordinate mismatch at a buffer boundary. The inspection notes reflected this carefully. The pattern was not widespread. It was specific. By early May, the file had grown thicker. A second coordination log was added, confirming that no intercept or alert had occurred. The log included a short notation about a track check, closed the same day. The timing matched the earlier entry. The language was neutral. At this point, the evidence met the threshold for institutional attention. Not because it suggested intent or danger, but because it showed a breakdown in documentation at a sensitive point. The inspection team flagged the amendment chain as incomplete. One routing change had been operationally executed, but the paper trail did not show the required approval sequence. This finding carried procedural weight. Documentation integrity was tied directly to clearance status and routing authority. The finding was forwarded to the security office with a standard cover letter. The cover letter included a date, a distribution list, and a request for review. It did not include conclusions. The early evidence phase closed with that handoff. What had begun as a filing issue had now crossed into formal review, supported by logs, receipts, and memos that all pointed to the same minute of flight time. By late spring of 1974, the review shifted from document collection to comparison. The question was no longer whether the records disagreed. It was whether the disagreement followed a pattern. The inspection team scheduled a standing review block every Tuesday morning. The sessions began at 9:30 a.m. and ran for 2 hours. Attendance was limited to personnel with routing, communications, or security responsibilities. Notes were taken by hand and typed later the same day. During these sessions, the disputed Minute 2:18 a.m. was placed alongside adjacent fixes. When plotted in sequence, the track made sense. The aircraft corrected drift gradually, as expected. The problem was that one document lagged the correction while another anticipated it. Neither document was clearly wrong. They were simply out of sync. This led to a closer look at how templates were used. The communications header for the position report matched a format introduced earlier that year. It required manual entry of grid references rather than automatic carryover from the previous report. In most packets, the grid reference advanced cleanly. In this one, the advance appeared early. A behavioral pattern emerged at the same time. The navigator's late drift correction, noted in the log, aligned with a period of increased workload on the flight deck. The correction was entered after the position fix, not before. This was permissible. It was documented. It explained timing, not documentation. The fuel receipt returned to the table. Its time of service stamp matched the aircraft's projected ground speed if the navigator's log was taken as primary. If the communications header was taken as primary, the timing compressed uncomfortably. The receipt did not prove intent or error. It weighted the interpretation. By June, the inspection notes reflected a shift in language. Early entries used discrepancy. Later entries used process interaction. The issue was no longer framed as a single mistake, but as the interaction between manual templates, late corrections, and amendment documentation. The security office entered the process quietly. A liaison attended one session and requested copies of the amendment chain. Within a week, an administrative hold notice was issued, not as discipline, but as a pause. One routing approval signature authority was temporarily suspended pending review. A separate clearance revalidation was delayed until the file closed. These actions were logged with dates and distribution lists. They affected schedules. One officer's planned travel was reassigned. A promotion board packet was held for the next cycle. The changes were procedural and visible only to the people tracking them. Pattern recognition extended beyond the single flight. 2 prior Arctic packets were re-examined. Both used the same communications template. Both showed late drift corrections. Neither crossed a buffer boundary on paper. The missing element in the March packet was the incomplete amendment chain. By midsummer, the review reached a stable conclusion. The aircraft's actual track could be reconstructed with reasonable confidence. The documentation chain could not. That distinction mattered. In institutional terms, records outlast recollection. The records were what needed repair. A draft finding summarized this in one sentence: no evidence of operational violation. Documentation integrity insufficient at boundary condition. The sentence was revised twice before final circulation. Each revision softened the tone without changing the meaning. The pattern had been recognized. The review moved to confirmation. Confirmation came from systems that did not rely on handwritten entries. In early August 1974, the inspection team received certified copies of the communications relay timestamps. These showed when the position report entered and exited the relay chain. The times matched the flight log within seconds. The content of the message, specifically the grid reference, remained the outlier. A second confirmation came from air defense tracking summaries. These were not detailed plots, but administrative records noting when tracks were correlated against expected routes. One entry, dated the same night as the flight, recorded a brief correlation check during the Arctic segment. The entry included a call time and a closure notation. It did not indicate an alert. It did confirm that the aircraft was being watched at the moment in question. The security office requested one more exhibit: the routing checklist used that week. The checklist showed the approved corridor, the buffer description, and the required sign-offs for amendments. The March packets checklist was complete, but the amendment page it referenced did not show the corresponding initial. The checklist assumed a step had been completed. The page did not prove it. This discrepancy was logged during a review session that began at 10 a.m. and ended before noon. The finding was written as a single line in the session notes: checklist, step, satisfied operationally, documentation, incomplete. By September, the confirming evidence supported a narrow conclusion. The aircraft had remained within expected operational parameters. The documentation had not. The difference mattered because documentation governed authority. Authority governed clearance. An internal memo formalized this. It recommended corrective action rather than disciplinary action. The memo listed 3 changes: revised amendment procedures, controlled templates for position reports, and a requirement for a second signature on Arctic route changes. Each item included an implementation date. The memo also closed one open question. The administrative hold on the delayed clearance revalidation was lifted once the corrective measures were approved. The routing approval authority was restored after a short refresher session, scheduled and completed within a single work week. The file was not closed. It moved to the final phase. The institutional response began quietly, with paperwork rather than announcements. On the 7th of October 1974, the inspection team circulated its final procedural finding to a limited distribution list. The document did not restate the flight narrative. It focused on controls. Its opening paragraph referenced the Arctic route, the date of the flight, and the specific boundary condition at issue. The remainder listed corrective actions and assigned offices responsible for each one. The first action was administrative. The security office issued a formal closure notice for the review, paired with a record of temporary measures already taken. The notice confirmed that no operational violation had been established. It also confirmed that documentation standards had not been met. Both statements were treated as equally important. A revised routing checklist was approved the same week. The revision added a second verification line for amendments affecting Arctic corridors. The line required a second initial and a time entry, written in the same hand as the correction. The checklist revision applied to all long-haul routes but cited Arctic operations as the triggering case. Communications procedures changed next. A controlled template replaced the earlier grid reference format for position reports on polar routes. The new template reduced manual entry and required explicit confirmation when advancing coordinates. The change was implemented during the next training cycle, with attendance logged by date and unit. One institutional step involved personnel files. A routing approval authority that had been paused earlier in the year was restored, but the restoration letter included a notation referencing the completed refresher session. The notation did not describe the incident in detail. It cited documentation review, March 1974, and listed the completion date. Another step affected scheduling. For the remainder of the quarter, Arctic route amendments required review during standard duty hours rather than overnight processing. This shifted some workload but reduced the chance of late entries. The change was logged in an operations bulletin dated the 15th of October 1974. Throughout this phase, there were no confrontations. Meetings were scheduled in advance. Minutes were taken. Each action generated a document that entered the same filing system as the original packet. The cabinet where the March folder had sat for months was opened and closed daily. The reminder slip was removed. For the clerk who had first flagged the discrepancy, the routine returned to normal. New packets arrived. Most were clean. The revised checklist became familiar within weeks. The controlled template reduced the kind of overwrite she had noticed in March. The institutions involved operations, security, communications, completed their actions by early winter. Each office reported closure to the inspection team. The final closure memo listed all actions as complete and noted the date range of the review. It did not assign blame. It assigned responsibility for future compliance. The aircraft continued to fly. Arctic routes remained in use. The difference was procedural and durable. The records now required clearer proof at boundary conditions. The institutional action phase ended without ceremony. The file moved to a long-term archive. Its reference number remained active for periodic checks. The final consequences were recorded the same way the discrepancy had been discovered, quietly, on paper, over time. By early 1975, the review file was officially closed. The closure memo listed the opening date, the duration of the review, 14 months, and the corrective actions completed. It did not restate the anomaly. It did not summarize the flight. It confirmed that documentation controls had been revised and implemented. For the individuals involved, the effects were measurable but limited. One officer's promotion packet moved to the next scheduled board after a clearance revalidation was completed. The delay was documented by dates, not commentary. Another individual experienced a temporary reassignment that altered a daily commute for several months. The change was logged as a staffing adjustment, with start and end dates. No one lost rank. No one faced criminal charges. The consequences lived in administrative records. The revised routing checklist became standard. By the summer of 1975, it appeared in packets for multiple long-haul flights, Arctic and otherwise. The second initial line was consistently filled. Overwrites became rare. The controlled communications template reduced manual coordinate entry, and relay logs showed fewer corrections after transmission. Years later, the March 1974 flight appeared occasionally in a different context. During routine clearance reviews, the reference number surfaced as part of a broader category. Documentation discrepancies resolved through process change. The entry was brief. It listed the year, the nature of the review, and the outcome. It did not describe the aircraft's position. For those reading the file long after the fact, the impression was not of a near miss in the air, but of a near failure in record keeping. The aircraft had continued on its route. The systems around it had adjusted. The clerk who first flagged the packet retired years later. Her personnel file showed consistent performance reviews and a steady work schedule. The filing cabinet she worked from was replaced during an office renovation. The folders were transferred to archive boxes, labeled, and stored. In later audits of Cold War-era routing procedures, the case appeared once more, cited as an example of why boundary conditions required extra verification. The citation was a single line. It did not expand. Files from that period show this was not the only review.